mean, I even have friends that are vegan that will eat oysters because they don't have a nervous system and they're not sentient. They're a superfood. They're so good for you. Really high in zinc and protein, selenium, omegas. But so they're sort of like a perfect food as well as they're good for the environment.
Hi there, everybody. This is Dani Valent, and you are with me for Dirty Linen. Super happy to be with you for a food chat. As I've been preparing for this chat, I have been contemplating one of my favourite food items. Is there anything better than a perfect oyster? I just don't think so. As for purity, for expression, for just the privilege of eating it, I think oysters are so special. My local Oyster Bar, Walrus, reopened recently after a 5-month hiatus, and it was wonderful to have some rock oysters there. Really just a celebration of terroir and of being there in St Kilda, enjoying these beautiful oysters. Just a privilege. The previous time that I had oysters was with today's guest. Isabelle Pearl Love-Dack runs Finn's Oyster Bar, which is a mobile oyster delight. I was really happy to come upon her at the Grounded Festival and have the oysters shucked to order, and they were so perfect. Bella, welcome to Dirty Linen.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So good to have you on the show. Tell us about Finn's Oyster Bar.
So I started Finn's Oyster Bar kind of randomly in end of 2022, but I'd been thinking about it for a while. My background's actually film and television. So I have 2 degrees in film and TV. I did my undergrad in Melbourne. I grew up on the Mornington Peninsula, and I did my Bachelor of Film and TV at Swinburne, and then I moved to Sydney and did my graduate diploma in production design afters, and kind of worked in that industry for 15-ish years. And when COVID happened, I lived in Sydney for ages, and I lived in WA and other parts of the world. When COVID happened, I was in London. I'd booked a one-way flight to London because I didn't think I was coming back to Australia on the New Year's Eve of 2019. During 2019, my son Finn passed away in an accident that was caused by his dad's mum's, so his grandmother, who was looking after him at the time, while I was in Fiji working on Survivor, which was my first job back from having a year off having him. And I was a few weeks into doing that, and I'd never left him before, like ever. It was always me and him, like every day. And I told myself that it was like okay and that it was all going to be fine. But his grandma put a travel neck pillow in his cot with him, which he choked to death. And then she took her life a few weeks later. And sort of from that, a lot of shit went down and split up with their dad. And I decided I was just going to leave and go to London. And so my sister was there, and she was staying with her best friend, Laurie Nunn, who's the writer and creator of Sex Education. And fun fact, the main sort of female character of Sex Education is based on my sister. And so went over there, thought, I'm going to work in Europe and start my life again and everything. And when I was meeting up with my Survivor colleagues in London, because a lot of them come from London, we decided to go on a pub crawl, and we met at Angel Station Pub. And I just had this like sort of strange feeling, and I was just like, I'm going to do a pregnancy test, and went with my sister to the local chemist, and we got a test and it was positive. So then we got 4 more tests and did that. And I was like, oh, okay. Because I'd like had 2 margaritas. So that's my daughter, Teddy. But then it started trickling in all the like, oh, there's a case of COVID here and there's a case of COVID there. And we'd gone to like Paris for a few days. And I was talking to this guy because it was like 1 case in Australia, 1 case in France. And I just said to my sister, like, I just think I should go back to Australia, like where I've got healthcare and like this kind of stuff. Like, and her and Laurie were like, oh, we think you should stay, like, da, 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 this is going to be nothing. And I went back, and then about approximately 2 weeks later, the entire world was in lockdown. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm glad I made that call. But I got sort of stuck at my friend Amy's house in Sydney. She was in another house. She had another house in Byron Bay. And I spent almost the entire pregnancy alone during 2020 in lockdown in her house in Sydney, just like watching the news, waiting for things to change. But it wasn't going to change. So me and my best friend rented a house in Ocean Grove because I was like, I can't live in the city. And kind of randomly, as a bit of a fresh start. And 10 days before my due date, I came back down to Victoria through the Ring of Steel out to Ocean Grove to this new house. And then, so it's sort of there for a long time, living together, and then got back into film and TV work when my daughter was about 2, and I did 2 big TV series, and I basically just never got to see her and was just picking her up and dropping her off in the dark, and I was doing a bad job at my jobs and at being there for her. So I had this old prop from a music video that a friend made, which was like a cart. And I sort of said, like Barwon Heads, Ocean Grove, why isn't anyone like shucking oysters like by the seaside kind of thing? Because I've always loved oysters. My middle name being Pearl, I've always loved seafood and oysters. And part of the time I was with my kid's dad, we lived on the south coast of New South Wales. So I knew a lot of the farmers, like from just going down to their farm gates and eating oysters all the time. And then, I sort of just decided I was going to open a little oyster bar business and started doing that. So like going through all the council stuff and all the permits and things like that, which is a lot harder than you think it's going to be. And it just sort of grew really like naturally from doing local pop-ups, doing friends events and things like that, doing the farmers markets. And then I think it was 2024, I got a scholarship from the Jetty Rock Foundation, which is in New Jersey, to do my level 1 oyster sommelier course with the Oyster Master Guild, which is sort of based in the Northern Hemisphere primarily. And I did that course, which was amazing, and I loved it. And then sort of just kept going and doing lots of like events and things and trying to like educate people about the world of oysters, because I think Australia is quite far behind in the sort of ways that we do things. Like Victoria virtually has no oyster industry because of government red tape and practices and things like that. But we have the Angassi oysters in the bay. We have rock oysters all around Gippsland and stuff that you can find. But people haven't really been successful getting farms off the ground here. And you'll go to an oyster bar in like anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe, in America, and you'll get 12 different oysters you can try and do like a tasting wheel, which we call the mewa, so like from the sea, as opposed to tewa, which is from the earth. And that was like a huge thing with the Oyster Master Guild, is sort of pioneering that oyster sommelier role or like being a master shucker. I wouldn't consider myself a master shucker, but I'm always trying to improve there. So that kind of is how I started doing that, and do a lot of weddings over summers and things like that, which is always fun. And then from that, I was sort of hassling James from Farm My School quite a lot, because we've been part of both the Farm My Schools and the Build Weekends. And I knew he was on the board of Be Alternative, and I knew about oyster shell recycling from the like other ones overseas, like specifically the Billion Oyster Project, which is the New York Hudson River system where they're, reviving all these reef beds. And I kept all my shells like for ages, and he finally got back to me and put me in touch with my boss, Belinda, through Shuck Don't Chuck, which is it's an initiative that's a partnership with the Nature Conservancy Australia, partnering with Be Alternative, because Nature Conservancies are not for profit. So Be Alternative is sort of the business side, and they do like at Grounded, they do the reusables and that kind of stuff at festivals mainly. And I was just trying to sign up as a business to have my shells collected. And after a sort of short conversation with Belinda, she was like, well, you know a lot about this. Do you want to work for us? So I do that as well. I do a lot of like venue coordinating and some like the social media and that kind of stuff. So the Walrus just came back on board with us. So that's great. But yeah, with that, we collect shell waste from venues and it gets taken down to a curing site on the Bellarine and cured. And then the science guys from Nature Conservancy go to the Marine Discovery Centre in Queenscliff. They process it, clean it, and then they redeploy it back out into Port Phillip Bay. And I think we've revived like 50 of 70 lost reef beds, which is great because basically like it's the same story in any industrialized city with a bay in the world, that like oyster reefs within about a decade of settlers arriving and things like that just absolutely decimated the population. So they got to Port Phillip Bay and they were like, wow, look at all these amazing oysters everywhere, gorged themselves. They were quite a like cheap food at the time. They were like primarily like sold in like Little Lonsdale Street and like the saloons and brothels and stuff, and the same sort of in New York. And then they burnt the shells for lime, so like Lime Burners Bay, and used it as a building concrete. Like you can find that in like a lot of the buildings in Little Lonsdale Street and stuff like that. They have oyster shell all through the foundations. And then dredged the bays so that they could get more ships in and stuff like that. So within about a decade, all the oyster beds were like considered functionally extinct and like covered in sediment and, you know, over harvested. In 1857, the Aboriginal women from both sides of the sea country, Wallarong and Woonwurrung, were banned from harvesting them. So they would usually go out in intertidal zones and for thousands and thousands of years were using them as a food source and in a sustainable way. And yeah, so that kind of has happened in multiple places around the world. And with shell recycling, with Shuck Don't Chuck, you get like a existing shell substrate and put it out into like areas, and baby oyster spat, which are like floating along in the water, will land on a stronger shell to like grow from, and then they sort of grow from there, grow a reef out, fish come, seaweed comes, all of that kind of stuff. And the Nature Conservancy guys are always diving and monitoring the sites and shown amazing growth all around Port Phillip Bay. It's actually part of a national-wide program called Reef Builder, but the Shuck Don't Chuck is just for Port Phillip Bay. And we've had a lot of interest from other states in Sydney and Gold Coast and South Australia trying to get us to establish a setup there. Other people do it, but not in a sort of centralised way. But yeah, we've been really successful over the last few years rebuilding it post-COVID. I did a truck ride along like a few months ago, and we get at least 35 bins per week just from South Melbourne Market. So the shell site out in St Leonard's is like literal mountains of shell that you can like see from space on a satellite image, which is really cool. But yeah, that's sort of what I do at the moment, as well as my oyster business. But I've also gotten back into film and TV since that. So doing a lot of different things.
Bella, you take a breath. What an amazing, swirling, comprehensive answer to a question about tell me about Finn's Oyster Bar. I mean, you've talked about, grief and bereavement, career change, the dramas of COVID, red tape, urban history, Indigenous practices and the impacts of colonisation. I feel like we went everywhere. And
Sorry, I know I talk a lot.
It's like it's amazing. And I think it speaks to so many things. But I think, where I want to like dig into a little bit, if it's okay with you, is, you've named Finn's Oyster Bar after your son, and, that's just so, devastating. And I can only imagine that grief is always there. Tell me how you carry that loss with you.
It's quite tricky. It's quite complicated because I think in Western society we're really like sort of trained to like ignore pain and sadness. But I've tried to make it like actively a process where I don't ignore things, by looking through photos, by constantly talking about him, keeping his name circulating when people ask who Finn is. But it's always hard. But I distinctly remember when he passed away, because there was all sorts of complications with, we weren't allowed to like take his body back to Victoria for the funeral because there was a shortage of cold transport, and I didn't want to have him embalmed. And they did about 3 autopsies on him and all of this stuff, and we didn't get his body back for like a week. Me and my friends were all in a shared accommodation in Perth, just waiting for them to give us his body. And basically we didn't have any choice other than to have him cremated in Perth and then take his ashes back for the funeral in Flinders. And yeah, during that time, I was looking up all sorts of things. And one of the things that like always stands out to me, just like from that blurry time, is when I first got off the plane. To their credit, like the Survivor crew were incredible. Like Animal Shine put me on a business class flight back, and I had like a handler, like a sort of, like he'd been in the army, and he did that if something happened to a contestant that had to go back, like if there was a death in the family or something like that. And he basically like carried me just like on the flights and like got me through the Melbourne airport, like out the side where like celebrities go, like we don't have to go through the main part. And like my sister and my friends were all there like waiting for me. But then we had to go to Perth, and then we, because I was living in the Pilbara at the time, and my ex came up to me, and one of the first things he said, like without even really saying hi or anything like that, was he just went, "There's no word for us." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "I've looked it up." He's like, "There's not a word for us. There's, you know, if you lose your husband, you're a widow. If you lose your parents, you're an orphan. Like there's all these labels, but there isn't one for us." And so that really stuck with me, and I got deep into reading about it. And there is only one word in like all societies and all cultures of the world. And it's sort of believed that it's too terrible of a thing to name. So people haven't given it a name. When labels can really help with that, to like define yourself so that you don't have to go into all of it. But there's one word in Sanskrit, which is viloma, which translates roughly to against the natural order. So that was like a big sort of thing I got looking into. And from that, I started looking at like a lot of other cultures and how they deal with death and what they can do with their, like, the body of their loved ones. And it's so interesting because, like, you know, even Māori culture in New Zealand, they will take the body home and put it like in the kitchen on the table, and all the family come around and like spend time with the body for a few days before they have a funeral. And so many cultures do that, where they get that time to sort of process it. Whereas in Western culture, we're just so sanitized from dealing with that kind of stuff. People would thought I wouldn't want to see his body or hold him and things like that. And eventually they let us have him for like a night, and we brought him back to the Airbnb and had it like an air conditioned room and had his little coffin next to the bed. So we had like a night to sleep with him. But yeah, like there's all these other things in the world that, you know, embrace death. And we don't. And so, yeah, I sort of tried to force myself to do that. But a lot of people, I think, found it like deeply uncomfortable because they couldn't fathom doing something like that. But yeah, and then we had his funeral, and I kept his ashes and everything, and it was really beautiful. There was like hundreds and hundreds of people there, like spilling out into the thing. And yeah, I guess like one of the like quotes that I always like kept really close in my mind was from Nick Cave, who's lost, I think, 2 of his sons now, which was that like the grief you feel is just equivalent to the love you had. So, you know, obviously we had quite a big love, and it affected a lot of people, being, you know, well, he was 13 months old. But it was like a celebrity's funeral. There was so many people there. It was just crazy. And I spoke at the funeral, and so did my ex. And yeah, people couldn't quite believe it. They were like, oh, she's going to be too, you know, fucked up to be able to speak. And I was like, no, I have to do this for him, and to keep him around. And yeah, but I find that it gets harder the more years that go on. He would have turned 8 a few weeks ago. And I find it almost impossible to imagine what he would look like and be like, because in my mind, he's still a baby. So yeah, and I just thought I would name my business after him because he loved food. Like, he was such a foodie, like both my kids are. Both of them ate oysters as babies and ate everything and had champagne taste. And so part of it was that, and part of it was just having that like constant reminder not to like ignore him and not to forget about him. Because it's really easy to do if you don't sort of train yourself to like look at things and stuff. And even when I do try sometimes like looking at photos and posting about him, my mind naturally goes like, oh, don't go there. But I have to sort of push through to be able to. But yeah, and I feel a bit embarrassed and silly sometimes, like sharing stuff of him so much. But I think there's something to be said about like, there's a lot of stuff now about don't share your kids online and don't post this and don't post that. But for me, it was like social media and Instagram was a really, really helpful thing to have this sort of timeline and photo collage of all of like the like amazing things we did together. And I'm glad that that's out there for me to like look back at and go through with my daughter who's 5. But yeah, it was a pretty crazy time. It definitely still affects me daily, you know, but yeah, it's a lot more now having a 5-year-old who asks a lot of questions and is, you know, she knows probably a bit too much about death than most 5-year-olds should. But yeah, we have open conversations about it all the time. And I try and just be really honest and open with her so that she understands some of the context of, yeah.
Well, I think a lot of kids who grow up in families where there's been a, you know, I don't know, untimely bereavement. I wish I could remember the Sanskrit word. That sort of things, not the natural order of things, not following the path. You know, they grow up with this big hole, like this big absence that's, you know, stronger than a presence. And I think for you to name that for your daughter and for her to be living in that truth, I'm sure that must be a better way for it to be. Yeah. I'm no expert. I'm just, yeah.
So I hear from people all the time that like stuff that their parents kept from them that they didn't find out till like a lot later in life, and then it really like hampered them trying to unravel that. So I just never wanted to do that to her. But yeah, she talks about like I did a lot of crazy like trying to do healing things post what happened, and like including that went to Bali with my sister and Laurie and saw a few healers and did a bunch of different stuff and tried all the things. But yeah, it was such a like I still feel his his presence around, and I definitely think that yeah, my daughter definitely does. When she was really little, when she was a baby and a toddler, before she could really speak, she would always just sit and babble towards the corner of the room that his ashes were in and like pick them up and like sort of, you know, do that. So I definitely feel like he's still around. But yeah, it's hard to sort of comprehend when, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've seen your daughter around at Finn's. She's definitely she's very present and a super bright spark. Tell us about oysters and the satisfactions of selecting perfect oysters and shucking them for customers who enjoy them in that moment.
Yeah, well, yeah, like I said, I've spent quite a few years around the South Coast, the Sapphire Coast area of New South Wales. and I love Sydney rock oysters. They're my favourite. And so I just reached out to like a few of the different farmers that I knew of, because I try and always get them direct from farmers. And I'm very snobby about my Sydney rocks and tend to favour them over others. Some things that like a lot of customers don't know when they get, cranky about the price or the, like Sydney rocks, I prefer South Australia, or I prefer Tassie oysters, is that Pacifics, which I still love, I still enjoy eating them, but they are actually an introduced species from Japan in the 1970s. They're not a native Australian oyster. So our Sydney rocks, the Sac-Australia glomerata, are a very special oyster in terms of the sort of world of oysters, and we have some incredible, unique Australian species. And the ones in the bay are the Angassis, and they're they're kind of cousin to the French oysters. They're very like minerally and zinky and much bigger with a flat top. And there's been quite a lot of success recently from the Whiffins, the Port Phillip, the Port Arlington mussel tours have been growing them for years and trying to get them to market for a long time. And they managed to last year have like a good market availability of those available. But yeah, I love Sydney rocks. So I try and generally always source them. And I always like to go straight from the farmers, because none of the farmers will ever sell them to you if there's been any kind of conditions gone bad. Like if there's heavy rain, they won't sell to you, because Sydney rocks are estuarine growing, and the rain will cause like runoff from farms and things like that. And because oysters are a filter feeder, they'll generally filter out any chemicals or things like that. They're sort of amazing. We call it like the liver of the sea. They're a yardstick for the health of the oceans around them. But yeah, and so I only ever get when they're going to be in the best conditions. A lot of my farmers won't farm through winter as well, because of different conditions and stuff like that. But yeah, it's like oysters are so amazing because they're like a lot of studies have come out of China specifically, but there's this idea that because they sequester carbon to create their shells and they filter the water and they don't need like food, they feed off microalgae, that if we had aquaculture farms along every coastline in the world, we could significantly reverse climate change, because they just do that much good for the planet. And I even have friends that are vegan that will eat oysters because they don't have a nervous system and they're not sentient. They're a superfood. They're so good for you, really high in zinc and protein, selenium, omegas. But so they're sort of like a perfect food, as well as they're good for the environment. So,
and what about, like you said that honestly, I would say you're great at shucking oysters. You said you're always working on it. Like, tell us about shucking an oyster. What do you need to consider?
Well, I'm always trying to make sure there's no damage to the oyster itself. So if they're kept in the right conditions, which is a lot trickier with Sydney rocks because they don't like being too cold. If they go sort of below 10 degrees, they can open up and die because they're from warmer waters, which is really fun trying to explain that to the council. But you're always wanting to you can go from the hinge, you can go from the side or the bill, which is the top. And you just want to pop that off and slice the top adductor muscle, because they're bivalves, they've got two muscles. And then from there, hopefully you haven't stabbed it or cut any of the outer gills or any of that. And it will have this beautiful liquid, which is the mewa, which is the source, the complete set of conditions grown in the sea. That's their sort of source flavour, and that's why all oysters taste different from whatever farm they come from. And then if you're in France, they don't cut the bottom muscle, they leave it like that. And that's why you always get an oyster fork when you're at a French restaurant or in France. And a lot of other people, and I cut the bottom muscle, which is apparently when the inner liquid is released. into the shell and then I do the flip, but not everyone does. Everyone's got super different ways of doing things. I never whenever I see, I don't know, I think pre-shucked oysters are a bit of a crime. I had like a friend out from America who was like, what's this amazing technology you have in Australia where you can buy pre-shucked oysters? I was like, there is none. It's just, most people wouldn't eat oysters in the oyster world that hadn't been opened within about 20 minutes but because they're alive and then as soon as you open them, that's when you kill them. So they're like so fresh and delicious and taste completely different. And I quite often get customers or guests at weddings who've said, oh, I didn't think I liked oysters, but I like them like this. But yeah, so whenever I have customers that want them to take home, I try and encourage them to learn to at least do like a basic shuck. I always say it's not hard to do, but it's hard to master and do it like really cleanly and perfectly. So I'm always aiming for there to be no grit, no cuts to the oyster itself, to have a bit of its liquid. But I'm not like incredibly fast, whereas some people are just like speed demons at it. But yeah, that's kind of why I like to shuck them to order. A lot of the places in London, the borough markets and stuff, they've got a few oyster guys out there that do that, which I loved seeing and connecting with when I was there. And then, yeah, that way it's as fresh as possible. You know that it's not been rinsed or, refrigerated or frozen or kept in any kind of strange way that might make you sick. I would never, that's how when I see people rinsing oyster meat and things like that, I'm like, no, I can't. But yeah, that's generally how they should all be.
What about garnishing, Bella? What's your opinion on adding flavours to oysters?
Well, I love doing that. Some people just like them completely natural. I grew up going a lot with my mum to Richmond oysters where you get all the different types and like a tempura one or a fresh one or this and that. My favourite is probably mignonette, which is traditionally red wine vinegar, pepper and shallots, but I often experiment with different vinegars and I make quite a few different vinegars at home. But yeah, I like that or just lemon, but I also love hot sauce. I generally use a range of hot sauces from my friends Ultraculture who are in Brunswick, and they make amazing fermented hot sauces. And we met at a farmer's market, I think in Woodend, and they do some amazing stuff. We did a pop-up together a few years ago and we actually had like a hibachi grill and had some Angassi oysters on the grill with, butter and green onions and things like that and some of their fermented sauces. And yeah, I think there's always room for new flavours. I love doing stuff like even caviar and, finger lime pearls, all of that kind of stuff, Davidson plum. Anything I kind of enjoy. I definitely enjoy fresh oysters over cooked ones, but I'm always willing to experiment and try different ones. I think that Kilpatrick is a bit of a travesty, but I won't try and offend anyone there because people are always like, oh, no Kilpatrick. And I'm like, no, sorry. Didn't bring bacon in an oven with me.
You mentioned that you think Australian oyster culture is a little bit behind some other places in the world. Like, what do you think, what would you love Australians to know about oysters and the culture around them?
Well, I think that, they sort of go hand in hand with like human beings and evolution. And they like I said, if you go to an oyster bar in America, Canada, Europe, you'll get a selection of different ones to try, which people are trying to do and are doing in Australia, but the sort of biosecurity laws and government stuff make it a lot trickier. I know my mate Dan in Sydney, who has Rock Oyster Depot, he usually tries to get about 4 or 5 different farmed rock oysters for people to try, and then you can compare the difference. But in terms of Australia, we don't have a lot of the other species being farmed. So we actually have, the black lip oysters up in the tropical parts of Australia and in the top end. And we have the pearl oysters up around Broome, which I love eating that meat. It's more like a scallop. And then we have, a bunch of other native oysters, the milky oysters up the north coast. But it's just, trying to get farms off the ground is quite a process with regulations and this and that. Whereas in America, they have a bunch of different varieties from all over the world, from Canada, from Europe, like imported and grown there. The Kumamoto Japanese oysters is a big one in America. And it's sort of interesting there because Japan was one of the like first places to export a lot of their oysters to the world. And now they're really struggling with their oyster reefs. And they've been managing to make some gains there with going to those American farms that have their oysters and retracing the DNA from the oysters being farmed that they were the true DNA match for the Japanese ones, and then getting more back into their country. It's really interesting. It's just sort of the import-export thing. We export a few senior rocks to Japan, but we don't really import any other species. And it's sort of interesting because even if an oyster isn't native, it's never really doing a bad thing for the environment. It's not really out-competing other species. I know that there's some trouble with the Chinese river oysters that have come in from like ship's ballast and stuff like that. But it's sort of that kind of biosecurity thing, which is amazing that we have in Australia. Like, we protect our biosecurity so much higher than so many other countries in the world. But from that, we also are quite limited in how many we have to offer and how many we can have like on a tasting menu. I think one of my favourite things I learnt in the Oyster Master Guild course is that the biggest producer of oysters in the world is China, and they export 0 of them. They just keep them all in the country. So I want to go there so badly. There's actually ancient Chinese cities that are built out of oyster shells and things like that. So they have a huge oyster culture, which a lot of people wouldn't think of like top of mind when thinking of Chinese cuisine. But yeah, it's really interesting. But I guess it just comes down to like import and export stuff with different countries, and as to why we don't have a more wide selection to choose from.
That's so fascinating. I think like if you only have one takeaway from that, it's that there are so many conversations you could have about oysters, and there's so much to learn. I would love to do a world oyster tour one day and just experience them. Yeah, just not only the oysters themselves, but the culture, and the fact that there are cities built from oyster shells is beyond amazing. It makes me think of First Nations middens, surround the coastline of Australia, and I suppose the lack of respect that they were given for the stories that they can tell, and and just the cultural heritage that's inherent in them. But there's such a part. Yeah, like as you've really well expressed, like they're just a part of who we are as humans, that connection to sea and harvesting and growing and, hopefully just coming to appreciate more and more. Bella, like I feel like we've gone so many places in this conversation. I'm really grateful to you for your openness and, just like your passion, your willingness to go there. I think it's really beautiful what you do, the way that you honour your son through it, and the way that your daughter is such a part of your business, just keeping all those stories alive, the personal ones, but also the ones that are inherent in oysters. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Sorry, I know I talk so much, so I was like trying not to go off on too many tangents.
We love the tangents. We love the tales. Thanks, Bella, for being part of Dirty Linen.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
This is Dirty Linen. I'm Dani Valent. We bring you untold stories from the food world. Real, raw, unafraid, hopeful. We're driven by a belief that food provides endless opportunities for learning, connecting, and creating the world we want to live in. Delicious, open-hearted, meaningful. If you know a story that needs telling, get in touch. Write to dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au. Thank you for listening.
This is a Deep in the Weeds production.